And four people that I instantly knew were my four grandparents, who I had never met in my life because they had all died before I was born. And I wanted to go and be with them so badly. But my guide, who had taken me this far, said, "No, you can't go now. There's someone somewhere else we have to go." Hi, I'm Karen Thomas, and I'm sharing my near-death experience today. It actually took place back in 1982, so it's been a very long time. At that point in time, I was a young mother with a 9-year-old and 6-year-old, and my husband and I had moved from upstate New York to Alaska. And I was working as a physical therapist there when I injured my back. I had had previous back surgery 5 years before. And once again, I was needing surgery because another disc had ruptured in my back. So on the day of surgery, my husband and my children came to the hospital with me. This was the hospital that I was actually working in. And so they were there with me in the morning, and I was one of the first of the morning surgeries. I was taken on a stretcher, and they walked with me, my husband and kids, as far as they could. And then I was in the OR suite. And once I was into the OR suite, I passed a long series of operating rooms and was taken into one toward the end of that hallway. And I remember moving over onto the operating room table and having the intravenous anesthetic started. But then, obviously, after that, I was unconscious. But suddenly, I became conscious again. And what was happening was that my consciousness was literally up in a corner of that operating room. And I was facing toward the ceiling, but hearing all of this noise going on that turned my attention back toward the middle of the room, where I could see my body on the operating room being flipped from being face down, where they were opening my back, to face up. And there was so much commotion. I heard the surgeon swearing and sending a nurse to try to get bags of transfusion blood. And all of this was going on, tremendous ruckus. And I realized that was me that was on that operating room table, but yet there was also me, my consciousness, up in this corner of the room. So I realized, if I'm here and I'm seeing this, then I must have died. So I became very worried about my husband and my kids in the waiting room. And so I thought my thoughts were about getting to them. And as soon as I thought it, I was able to literally move through the wall of this operating room and out into that hallway I had come down, and all the way through that hallway, out of the operating room suite area, and trying to get to this waiting room. And then I heard a voice, a telepathic voice, and it said, "Pay attention to this man." And so as it said that, I noticed that there was a man in street clothes who was rushing in the direction I had just come from. And I, although I'm very nearsighted, was able to like zoom in on him very close to be able to see his hair color, his features, his eye color, the clothing he was wearing, and began to hear his thoughts about, "I have to get in there. I've got to get in there fast." And then at the same time as he passed me back toward the operating suite, my attention followed where he was going, and I noticed another man near the doors going into the operating suite. And I began to hear his thoughts. And his thoughts were, "What does this guy think he's doing? He can't just go into that room where, into where they're operating on people." And the man I was initially supposed to pay attention to slowed down and stopped for a moment, and then double doors swung open, and he went through and went into the operating suite. Once that took place, my attention was back to, I need to find my husband and kids. And as I started to think that, suddenly, although I had gone where I wanted to go up to this point, I began to feel as though I was no longer directing where I could move. And I, in fact, felt a pulling sensation that pulled me literally up through the ceiling of the floor I was on, up into the next floor of the hospital, completely out of the hospital altogether, high up into the sky, and then began to move horizontally all over out over the city of Anchorage, which is where this was taking place, in Anchorage, Alaska. And as I got past the city, it was sitting on the bay, and if I had continued more, I would have been over the water, but instead, a huge opening, a big, what looked as though it was like a cave or a tunnel, very dark, opened in front of me, and I was drawn inside that. And once I was inside the dark tunnel area, all I could see in the very, very far distance was like a pinprick of light. But I began moving very, very fast in the direction of that pinprick of light. And as I did, the light itself was getting bigger and bigger and bigger as I was getting closer to it. And then I remember just bursting out through the light, into the light, and having this enormous sense of peace and love and calm that just engulfed and filled me as I came into this bright, bright area. And I remember thinking about, where am I? What is this place? And tried to look it over, and noticed that as I looked down, I could see the ground that was very brown and rocky, but I couldn't see any feet or any of my own body parts. And then I was looking continually around this kind of very arid area, and the telepathic voice again spoke, saying, "Follow me." And as it did, it drew my attention off to my left, and I could see a man who was climbing up out of this low area that I had come out in, up a slope. And as soon as the words "follow me" were spoken, I was only a few feet behind him as he was climbing up this slope. And so I looked at his back and looked him over and saw that he had, very almost black hair, and long, that was pulled back and tied with a piece of leather, and just a very plain toga-like garment that was an off-white color. And again, just a very simple tie belt. And then he had sandals on his feet with ties that crisscrossed up his thighs and tied below the knees. And I had thought, well, I'm dead. Shouldn't I be seeing Jesus? And somehow I just knew that this man wasn't Jesus, though I had no idea who he was. And so I continued to follow him as he went up over the slope and into what became a totally different landscape. It was beautiful and lush green and filled with flowers of colors that I had never imagined before, and trees in the distance. And I was just so enthralled with this, especially the fact that this whole landscape was infused with light that emanated out of everything, the blades of grass, the flowers themselves. It was just fascinating. And as I was taking this in, the man that I had followed up the slope continued and then called again to me telepathically, saying, "Follow me." And I was immediately behind him on the bank of a river. And the river itself was about, I don't know, 20 feet or so across, but very, very sparkling clear and letting off light just like everything else. And I could see the opposite bank of this river. And as I saw it, I was amazed to see all of my loved ones who had passed away that were gathered together there. And I could just feel this sense of welcoming and love from them. And I saw my father, who had died when I was 7, and my brother, who had been killed in a car accident, aunts and uncles who had passed away, and 4 people that I instantly knew were my 4 grandparents who I had never met in my life because they had all died before I was born. And I wanted to go and be with them so badly. And they wanted me to come there. And they were welcoming and so saying they were so glad to see me. But my guide, who had taken me this far, said, "No, you can't go now. There's someone somewhere else we have to go." And so he continued walking along this side of the side of the river that we were on, down and around a curve in the river. And then it opened up into a huge open area that was in the center, had a huge, enormous building that looked like Greek or Roman, very, very white, glowing like everything else was, and with columns in along the front of it, and a big line of stairs that we went up and up to the entrance doors. And the doors opened, and he asked me again to follow him. And we went inside, and this inside appeared to be an enormous library. And on this library was so filled on both sides and all the way up past as far as I could see. I couldn't even see a ceiling, but just, floors upon floors upon floors, jam-packed with books and old scrolls. And down through the whole center opening area of this building were all of these tables, and there were spiritual beings that were there, and some were standing, some sitting at the tables. And my guide said, "This is where the books of life are stored, but we're not staying here. Follow me." And so I did, through this entire open area of the center area of this huge building. And at the back, there was a doorway and entering into a small hallway. And then just a short distance, there was another doorway that went into a much smaller room. And inside this room, there appeared to be like a big oval area that all of the people, the spiritual beings who were already there, were centered around it. And as we walked in, I thought, I should know who these people are. And I just had this feeling that they had helped me plan this life that I was living. And at that point, my guide said, "We're going to review your life up to this point." And when he said it, this center area that they were circled around became like a hologram. It lifted up, and all through the center of it, it was as though I were living everything that had taken place in my life up to that point over again, being it, experiencing it, but then also experiencing the different people that I was interacting with and what they were feeling as we were interacting with each other. And it was the most amazing thing to experience this. It seemed like it took infinite amount of time, but in an instant, if you can imagine that. And it was amazing to really understand what other people were feeling through how we interacted with each other. And whenever I would feel bad about something hurtful that I had done, all those that were in the group around the oval would send back to me the feeling of it's okay. It's okay. It's how you learn how important it is to be kind when you're interacting with other people, and what you should do and what you can do when you were acting with love. So that was amazing. And then I was told I could stay if I wanted, or I could return to my life. But if I did return to my life, they wanted to show me things of my future, some of which definitely would happen, others that really it depended on the free will that other people I would interact with might choose or not choose to do. So at that point, I don't recall anything about my future that I was shown. I I was told later that I couldn't remember anything from my future if I were to return to my life, because that would take away my free will, and that my free will was very important. And so I know I saw this future, but I have no recall of it. And the next recall I have is being in a much smaller room, again with my guide. And at this point, he was showing me, he wanted to show me the waiting room where my husband and my daughter and son were, but he also wanted to show me prayers of people who were praying for me. And off to my right, as I looked that way, I could see what looked like musical notes, half notes, quarter notes, and they looked like they were going vertically instead of horizontally across the score. And my guide told me that each one of those musical notes represented a person's prayer who was praying that I might live. And they each kept connecting and coming up closer to where we were. And as I looked off to the left again to see the waiting room, I saw the doctor who had operated on me standing in a doorway, and my husband standing in front of him, and the doctor in his scrubs, and talking to my husband, and my children further inside the room near a small couch. And I saw that my daughter was scared that I had died, and that's what that doctor was telling my husband. And she prayed and prayed that I would live. And as soon as she did, that became the last musical note or prayer. And when it finally reached where we were, all of my emotion of being my human self, all of my love of my husband and my kids rushed back into me. All of my concern of their having to go on with their lives without me came back. And I knew that I had to make the choice to return to my life. And, I was a child that grew up without my father, and I didn't want that for my kids. So once I made that decision, I don't remember a return trip at all. I simply remember waking up in a recovery room with my husband and kids beside me. And the strangest thing of that was that I felt as though I had two levels of consciousness going on. My physical body and brain consciousness was still coming out of anesthesia and very confused and not even remembering why I had been in the hospital and what was going on at all. And then what I've come to call my spiritual consciousness was as sharp and as clear about everything that I had just had in my near-death experience. And I felt as though I was enwrapped and filled with the love and peace that I had experienced on the other side. And so both of these things were happening at the same time. And I ended up having to be in the hospital for a total of 12 days in intensive care and on the ward. And over the time that I was in the hospital, there was a doctor who came in who walked in the first time to check on me, and I instantly recognized him as the person that I'd been told to pay close attention to. As it turns out, he had been called to the hospital stat to try to save my life, and in fact did do an additional surgery that saved my life, repaired the artery that had been cut and that had caused me to bleed out on the operating room table. So I got to, after being discharged and having to go back to have staples removed by this doctor, I got to ask him about what I had seen that day in terms of him rushing, what he was wearing, what had happened. And his response to me was, "How could you know that?" And that's when he told me that he'd been in his office seeing patients, had been paged, and had come, to the hospital to try to save my life. So that is my near-death experience. And over the many, many decades, actually over 40 years now, that it has been since then, I was able 30 years later to recontact with the surgeon who had saved my life. And he did still remember my case, and that I had told him about my near-death experience when I had seen him, for getting staples out after the surgery. And that was nice. I really got to thank him again. And I just have had a number of amazing experiences throughout all the years from that time. Some that allowed me to kind of have a deja vu memory that, oh, this was one of the things of my future that I was shown. And I would never remember until it was actually taking place. So now I try to share the most important thing that I've learned from my near-death experience, which is that we are here to love one another, and that we should always be aware of how our words and our actions are continually impacting not just a person that we're with at that time, but they can also carry that forward and carry that same emotion and love and care onto the people in their lives. So I hope that you have gotten something from this sharing that I have. And if you are interested in just speaking maybe more to me about it, or have something that occurs to you that you would like to say directly to me, I can share my email address, and that is BLANCETH@live.com. And should you choose to email me, it would be important for you to put in the subject line, "Saw Your Near-Death Experience Podcast." So thank you, and I appreciate everything that you've taken your time to listen to me.